The cargo freighter Stellar Nomad wasn't exactly what you'd call a luxury liner. Hell, it wasn't even what you'd call comfortable. But it was home to Captain Gia and her ragtag crew of misfits who somehow managed to keep the rust bucket flying through the galaxy's less civilized sectors. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Captain, Yuki's voice crackled through the comm, tinged with that particular blend of boredom and resignation that came from spending too many cycles hauling synthetic protein bars to mining colonies. We're picking up a distress beacon. Automated signal from research station Theta 9. Gia leaned back in her command chair, which had seen better decades and probably better centuries. Theta 9? That's the xenobiology research facility, right? The one that studies… what was it again? Interspecies behavioral adaptation. Gorthak rumbled from his engineering station, his 4 arms working simultaneously on 3 different repair diagnostics. The Velkarian's translation implant gave his voice a mechanical undertone that somehow made everything sound vaguely disapproving. They specialize in studying how different alien species adapt to new environments and social structures. Behavioral adaptation. Gia snorted. Fancy words for, let's see what happens when we put a bunch of different aliens in a box together. How's their signal strength? Weak but steady, Yuki replied. Standard emergency frequency. No voice transmission, just the beacon. Now that was interesting. Research stations didn't typically go silent unless something had gone very, very wrong. And in Gia's experience, when something went wrong in the Outer Rim territories, it usually involved either pirates, equipment failure, or something trying to eat the inhabitants. Sometimes all 3. Set course for Theta 9, Gia ordered, already knowing she was probably making a mistake. But that was the thing about being human. You made the mistake anyway, because ignoring a distress call was the kind of thing that kept you awake at night. And Gorthak, run a full systems check. If we're walking into trouble, I'd prefer our engines don't decide to take a vacation. Already on it, Captain, the engineer replied, which was why Gia kept him around despite his tendency to lecture her about proper maintenance schedules. The journey to Theta 9 took them deeper into the Helix Nebula, where space traffic was about as common as honest politicians. The research station hung in the void like a metal tumor, its usual constellation of running lights reduced to a few emergency beacons that blinked lazily in the darkness. Well, that's not ominous at all, Gia muttered, studying the station through the view screen. Yuki, any signs of life? Minimal power signatures, the pilot reported. Emergency life support is running, but everything else looks dead. No response to hails. Docking bay? Looks intact. I can get us in, but I'm not guaranteeing we can get back out if something goes sideways. Has anything ever gone sideways with us? Gia asked with false cheerfulness. The silence that greeted this question was answer enough. Right. Gorthak grabbed the portable scanners. Rhea, medical kit, and trauma supplies. And everyone, weapons. The docking bay of Theta 9 was tomb quiet, filled with the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. Emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly red glow, and the air recyclers wheezed like an old man with lung problems. Cheerful place, Yuki observed, her hand resting on her sidearm. Really screams welcome to our happy research facility. They moved through the station in standard formation, Gia leading, Gorthak scanning for environmental hazards, Rhea watching for anything that might need patching up, and Yuki covering their rear with the paranoid efficiency of someone who'd survived too many supposedly routine salvage operations. The main laboratory levels told a story written in scorch marks and dried blood. Equipment lay scattered and broken. Data terminals flickered with corrupted displays, and the walls bore the distinctive blast patterns that screamed, "Raider attack." "Raiders!" Gorthak confirmed, his scanner beeping softly. Energy weapon signatures consistent with Kresh pulse rifles. Attack occurred approximately 8 standard days ago. "Any survivors?" Gia asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Negative life signs in this section," Rhea reported, checking her medical scanner. "But, Captain, there's something in the lower levels. Multiple contacts, very faint biosignatures. They descended through maintenance shafts and emergency corridors, following Rhea's scanner deeper into the station's bowels. The deeper they went, the more the place felt like a tomb, until they reached sub-level 5, where the scanner started going crazy." "They're behind that door," Rhea whispered, pointing to what looked like a storage compartment that someone had hastily reinforced with metal plating and emergency barriers. Gia approached carefully, pressing her ear to the makeshift barrier. From inside came the faintest sounds, scratching, scuffling, and something that might have been breathing. "Hello?" she called softly. "We're here to help." "We received your distress signal." The sounds inside stopped completely. Then, after a moment of absolute silence, came a noise that made everyone's blood run cold. A low, threatening growl that spoke of teeth and claws, and the kind of desperation that made anything dangerous. "Well," Gia said quietly, "that's not exactly the warm welcome I was hoping for." They managed to pry open the makeshift barrier, and what they found inside made Rhea suck in a sharp breath. The storage compartment had been converted into a crude shelter, lined with torn fabric and scattered with the remnants of emergency rations. And huddled in the far corner, pressed together like a defensive wall of fur, scales, and terror, were 6 of the most pathetic creatures Gia had ever seen. They were young, that much was obvious. Different species, different sizes, but all bearing the unmistakable markers of youth. Oversized eyes, downy fur, or soft-edged scales. And all of them were staring at the humans with the kind of feral terror that came from watching everyone you trusted get killed. "Oh, stars," Rhea breathed. "They're just children." The largest of the group, a creature that looked like someone had crossed a wolf with a porcupine and given it anger management issues, let out another threatening growl and positioned itself between the humans and the smaller creatures. "Easy there, big guy," Gia said softly, keeping her hands visible and non-threatening. "We're not here to hurt anyone." Her words had exactly the opposite effect she'd intended. All 6 creatures recoiled as if she'd struck them, pressing themselves against the back wall with a chorus of hisses, chirps, and snarls that would have done a nest of angry vipers proud. The attackers, Gorthak realized quietly. They probably spoke basic, too. To these younglings, our language means danger. Gia studied the terrified group. There was a small, crystalline creature that seemed to shimmer with internal light. Something that looked like a cross between a bird and a lizard, with iridescent feathers that were currently standing on end. A furry, cat-like being with 6 legs, and the biggest, most liquid eyes she'd ever seen. Each one was different, each one was scared, and each one looked like they'd fight to the death before letting another adult near them. They're orphans, she realized. The research staff. These must be their children. The raiders killed their parents. "Captain," Rhea said urgently, "we need to get them medical attention. They're malnourished, dehydrated, and showing signs of severe psychological trauma." Right. Easy part's over, Gia muttered. Now we just have to convince 6 terrified, potentially lethal alien children to trust the nice humans who speak the same language as the people who murdered their families. What could possibly go wrong? The answer, as it turned out, was everything. Their first attempt at contact resulted in the wolf-porcupine creature lunging at Kemp with claws extended and teeth bared. Only Gorthak's quick reflexes with a stun net prevented what would have been a very messy introduction. The second attempt involved Rhea trying to approach with medical supplies and soothing words. The bird lizard thing responded by projecting a sonic screech that shattered 2 light fixtures and left everyone's ears ringing for 20 minutes. By the third attempt, even Gia was starting to wonder if they should just contact the authorities and let someone else deal with 6 traumatized alien children who seemed determined to kill anyone who came within lunging distance. "They've been alone for over a week," she said, watching the creatures from the doorway. "Surviving on scraps, waiting for the next attack, watching every shadow, for threats. They don't trust anyone, and honestly, I can't blame them." "So what do we do?" Yuki asked. "We can't just leave them here." "And we can't force them to come with us," Rhea added. "The trauma they've experienced, forcing them would only make things worse." Gia stared at the 6 small creatures huddled together in their makeshift shelter, bristling with hostility and terror in equal measure. They'd survived something that had killed trained adult researchers. They'd kept each other alive through pure, stubborn determination, and the kind of desperate courage that only came from having absolutely nothing left to lose. "Pack up everything we can carry from their shelter," she ordered finally. "Their blankets, their food, anything that smells like home. We'll set up a secure area in Cargo Bay 2 and transport them there, if they won't trust us." She paused, an idea beginning to form. "Maybe we need to stop trying to make them trust us." "Captain?" Gorthak's translator made his confusion sound mechanical. "Sometimes," Gia said, watching the smallest of the creatures, a delicate, almost ethereal being that seemed to be made of living shadow, peek out from behind the others with eyes like liquid starlight. "The best way to help someone isn't to convince them you're safe. It's to prove that they're safe with you." It was a distinction that would make all the difference in the worlds to come. Back aboard the Stellar Nomad, Cargo Bay 2 had been transformed into what Gia generously called a secure habitat, and what any sane person would have called a reinforced prison cell with mood lighting. The Cubs' makeshift shelter had been carefully reconstructed in one corner, complete with their tattered blankets and the few personal items they'd managed to salvage. The rest of the bay was sealed off with emergency barriers that could theoretically contain 6 small, angry aliens. Theoretically being the operative word. "Day 3 of operation, please don't eat us," Yuki announced over the comm system with the kind of forced cheer that came from someone who was definitely not getting enough sleep. Current casualty count: 2 medkits, 1 portable scanner, and Kemp's dignity. The Cubs had settled into their reconstructed nest, like a defensive formation designed by paranoid military tacticians. The big one, the wolf-porcupine hybrid that Gia had privately dubbed Umbra, maintained a constant watch position while the others huddled behind him. They'd arranged themselves so that the smallest, most vulnerable members were in the center, protected by layers of increasingly hostile guardians. It would have been touching if it weren't so absolutely terrifying. "Gorthak's up next," Rhea reported, checking her medical scanner readings from outside the bay. "His theory is that pheromone communication might work better than verbal attempts." "Because the first dozen attempts worked so well," Gia muttered, watching through the observation window as the EIB Valkyrian engineer approached the barrier with his forearms spread wide in what was supposedly a universal gesture of non-aggression. Gorthak began releasing a complex series of chemical signals, scents that supposedly conveyed peace, safety, and parental protection, according to his species' biological database. The response was immediate and educational. The crystalline creature, Shimmer, as Gia had started thinking of her, began to pulse with increasingly agitated light patterns. The bird lizard thing started that sonic screeching again, and something that looked like a cross between a ferret and a small dragon began releasing its own pheromones that smelled distinctly like rotting fish mixed with aggressive territorial marking. "Well," Gorthak announced, backing away from the barrier as his translator unit struggled with what sounded like a very creative string of multi-species profanity. "That was educational." "Let me guess," Gia said. "They told you exactly where you could stick your peaceful intentions in several different languages." The small reptilian one has a particularly colorful vocabulary for someone who can't be more than 3 standard cycles old, Gorthak admitted. "And I believe the crystalline being just threatened to crystallize my internal organs, which is anatomically impossible, but points for creativity." Yuki tried next, approaching with offerings of high-energy food bars and the kind of patient, gentle tone usually reserved for coaxing frightened animals out of hiding. She made it approximately 2 meters from the barrier before the ferret dragon thing launched itself at the reinforced transparent aluminum with enough force to crack the surface. "Right," Yuki said, backing away as 6 pairs of hostile eyes tracked her movement. "Note to self, they really don't like it when strangers approach with food. Probably reminds them of—" She didn't finish the sentence, but they all knew what she meant. The raiders had probably offered them food too, right before the slaughter started. Ria's medical approach was next, and it went about as well as expected. The moment she activated her bioscanner, every single cub went into full defensive mode. Umbra positioned himself like a living shield, while the others arranged themselves in a formation that would have impressed a military tactician. When she tried to extend a medical probe through the barrier, the sonic screech from the bird lizard nearly shattered every piece of equipment in the cargo bay. "They're protecting each other," Ria observed, nursing her ringing ears. Classic pack behavior in response to perceived medical threats. They probably associate scanners and medical equipment with the experiments their parents were conducting, or with what happened to their parents when the raiders found them, Gia added grimly. Each attempt seemed to make the cubs more agitated, more defensive, and more determined to reject any form of contact. They'd huddled together, after each failed interaction, the larger ones maintaining vigilant watch, while the smaller ones trembled with exhaustion and fear. Kemp tried a technological approach, using universal translators and holographic displays to project images of safety and comfort. The cubs responded by systematically destroying every piece of equipment he sent through the barrier, with a efficiency that spoke of considerable intelligence and absolute determination. "They're not just scared," Ria realized during one of their increasingly frustrated strategy sessions. "They're actively hostile to any form of adult authority. The trauma has conditioned them to see any adult as a potential threat." "Can you blame them?" Gia asked, watching the cubs through the observation window. They were grooming each other with the kind of desperate tenderness that spoke of a family unit trying to hold itself together through sheer force of will. "Everyone they trusted is dead. Every adult who ever cared for them was murdered. From their perspective, we're just the next wave of threats." "So what do we do?" Yuki asked. "We can't keep them locked in cargo bay indefinitely. They need medical attention, proper nutrition, And what? Gia interrupted. A nice foster family? Someone to adopt 6 traumatized alien children who've been conditioned to see every adult as a potential killer? Face it, people. The authorities will take one look at these kids and declare them irreparably damaged. Best case scenario, they end up in some sterile research facility being studied like specimens. Worst case. She didn't need to finish. They all knew what happened to dangerous, uncontrollable alien specimens in the Outer Rim territories. There has to be another way, Rhea insisted. They're children, Gia. Traumatized, terrified children who've been through something no one should have to experience. I know that, Gia snapped, then caught herself. The stress was getting to all of them. I know that, Rhea. But knowing doesn't change the fact that they won't let any of us within striking distance. And honestly, I'm starting to think they're right to be suspicious. The breaking point came on the 4th day, when the largest cub, Umbra, launched himself at the barrier with enough force to actually crack the reinforced material. Not at random, not in panic, but in a calculated attack aimed at the weakest point in their containment. He was testing their defenses, planning an escape. Smart kid, Gia muttered, watching him systematically probe the barrier for weak points while the others watched and learned. Too smart for his own good. Captain, Kemp called urgently from his position near the environmental controls. We've got a problem. The barrier won't hold if he hits it like that again. The resonance frequency from that sonic screech is weakening the molecular bonds in the transparent aluminum. So we reinforce it, Yuki suggested. With what? More barriers? Heavier security? Measures? Gia shook her head. All that does is prove to them that we're exactly what they think we are. Another group of adults who want to cage them, control them, and probably hurt them. She watched Umbra position himself for another attack, his body language screaming defiance and protective fury. Behind him, the other 5 cubs arranged themselves in support formation, ready to follow their self-appointed leader into whatever came next. They're not just trying to escape, she realized suddenly. They're trying to protect each other. Umbra thinks if he can break through the barrier, he can lead the others to safety. He's willing to sacrifice himself if it means the smaller ones have a chance. Captain? Gorthak's mechanical voice carried a note of confusion. Look at them, Gia said, pointing at the cubs' formation. Really look. Umbra's positioning himself as the primary threat, drawing our attention. The crystalline one is building up energy for some kind of defensive burst. The bird lizard is preparing another sonic attack. But see how the 3 smallest ones are positioned near the back wall? They're not planning to fight. They're planning to run. A coordinated escape attempt, Rhea breathed. They're working together like a military unit. Like a family, Gia corrected. A family that's been through hell and is determined not to lose anyone else. Umbra launched himself at the barrier again, and this time the crack spread halfway across the transparent aluminum surface. Alarms started blaring as the structural integrity warnings kicked in. Captain? Orders? Yuki asked, her hand hovering over the emergency containment controls. Gia stared at the 6 cubs preparing for what they clearly saw as a life-or-death battle against overwhelming odds. They were terrified, exhausted, and outnumbered, but they were still willing to fight for each other, still willing to risk everything to protect their makeshift family. Stand down, she ordered quietly. Captain? I said stand down. All of you. Back away from the cargo bay. Give them space. Gia, if they escape, Rhea started. They're not escaping, Gia said, settling into a chair positioned well back from the observation window. They're just scared kids who think they need to fight for their lives. so we're going to stop giving them reasons to fight. The cubs seemed confused when no reinforcements arrived, when no additional security measures activated, when the adults simply stepped back. Umbra maintained his aggressive stance for several more minutes, but gradually his posture shifted from attack-ready to merely wary. "Now what?" Yuki asked quietly. "Now," Gia said, watching the smallest cub, the shadowy creature she'd started thinking of as Nyx, peer curiously around Umbra's protective bulk. "We try something completely different. It was a gamble that would either save them all or get everyone killed. But then again, Gia had never been particularly good at playing it. Safe, Gia's completely different approach turned out to be sitting on the floor of Cargo Bay 2 like she owned the place and talking to absolutely no one in particular. "So there I was," she said conversationally to the empty air, her back against the far wall and her legs stretched out casually in front of her, stuck in a maintenance shaft on some god-forsaken mining station, covered in lubricant grease and questioning all my life choices. The cubs, who had been prepared for another confrontation with aggressive adults, seemed genuinely baffled by this development. Umbra maintained his defensive position, but his ears, if those pointed protrusions could be called ears, were swiveled forward with obvious curiosity. "And Yuki," Gia continued, still not looking directly at the cubs, but speaking as if she were recounting the story to an invisible companion. "Yuki has the audacity to call down the shaft and ask if I've found the problem yet. Like I'm some kind of mechanical genius, instead of someone who's spent the last 2 hours trying to figure out which end of a hydrospanner goes where." She paused to shift her position, moving slowly and deliberately, keeping her hands visible and her posture relaxed. "You know what the problem was? Someone had installed the plasma coupling backwards. Backwards. Who does that? I swear, sometimes I think the universe has a personal vendetta against anyone trying to make an honest living hauling cargo through space." The sonic screeching bird lizard, who Gia had started thinking of as Growl due to the constant low rumbling it produced, actually stopped making aggressive noises. Instead, it tilted its head with the kind of focused attention that suggested it was trying to parse this unexpected behavior. Course, that's nothing compared to the time Gorthak tried to optimize our navigation computer, Gia went on, settling into what was clearly going to be a long-term occupation of the cargo bay floor. 4 arms, you'd think that would make him better at multitasking. Instead, he somehow managed to program our autopilot to take us on a scenic tour of every asteroid field in the sector. She reached into her jacket pocket, moving deliberately slowly so the cubs could see exactly what she was doing, and pulled out a nutrition bar. Instead of offering it to them, she unwrapped it and took a bite herself. "Scenic," she repeated around the mouthful of synthetic protein. That's what he called it. Scenic. Like getting pelted by space rocks the size of shuttlecraft was some kind of tourist attraction. For the first time since they'd found the cubs, none of them were actively snarling. Shimmer, the crystalline creature, had dimmed her internal light to a soft, curious glow, instead of the aggressive strobing she'd been maintaining. The ferret dragon thing, Flick, Gia decided, based on the way its tail constantly twitched, had actually crept a few inches closer to the front of their makeshift nest. "The real kicker," Gia continued, pulling out another nutrition bar and setting it on the floor beside her without any fanfare, "was when we finally made it to the delivery point, and the station administrator looks at our cargo manifest and says, 'Oh, did we forget to mention the mineral samples need to be kept at sub-zero temperatures?'" She took another bite of her nutrition bar and shook her head in theatrical disgust. 2 weeks in space hauling what we thought were standard geological specimens, and it turns out we've been transporting ice cream ingredients that turned into expensive soup somewhere around the third day. The smallest cub, Nyx, the shadow creature with the liquid starlight eyes, had moved from behind Umbra's protective bulk to his side, still sheltered, but now able to see Gia directly. Its form seemed less solid when it was curious, rather than terrified, like it was made of living darkness held together by will and wonder. "You want to know the worst part?" Gia asked her invisible audience, finishing her nutrition bar and crumpling the wrapper. The worst part was explaining to the client why their premium dessert supplies had turned into premium dessert soup. You try explaining the finer points of thermodynamics to someone who's expecting frozen treats and getting lukewarm pudding. She set another nutrition bar on the floor, this one a little closer to the cub's position, and continued her seemingly random commentary on the trials and tribulations of space freight. "Then there's the time Rhea decided she wanted to improve our medical facilities." Sounds reasonable, right? Upgrade the autodoc, install better diagnostic equipment, maybe add some basic surgical capabilities. Gia snorted. What she didn't mention was that the new autodoc had an AI personality that thought it was a therapist. This actually got a reaction, a soft chittering sound from what looked like the cat-like creature with 6 legs. It was pressed against the back wall of their shelter, but its ears, definitely ears this time, were perked forward with interest. "I'm serious," Gia said, as if responding to the chittering. This machine would diagnose a broken arm and then spend 20 minutes asking how the injury made you feel and whether you had unresolved issues with your parents. Kemp went in for a routine vaccination and came out questioning his entire career path. She placed a third nutrition bar on the floor, establishing a trail of offerings without any apparent intent or pressure. Just food, casually distributed, like someone might share snacks during a storytelling session. The AI therapist Autodoc, she continued, decided that Gorthak had boundary issues because he preferred to work alone in the engine room. Spent 3 hours trying to convince him that mechanical systems were a metaphor for his fear of emotional intimacy. The chittering sound came again, softer this time, almost like laughter. "Right?" Gia said, grinning at the empty air. "An AI that thinks hydraulic systems are Freudian symbols. I swear, sometimes I wonder how we've managed to survive this long without accidentally airlocking ourselves out of sheer stupidity." Over the next several hours, Gia established what could generously be called a routine. She would enter the cargo bay, settle onto the floor in the same spot, and proceed to regale no one in particular with stories of her crew's various misadventures. The cubs gradually stopped treating her presence as an immediate threat, though they maintained their defensive positions. "The thing about Yuki," she said during her second session, "is that she's absolutely fearless when it comes to flying through asteroid fields or dodging patrol ships, but show her a spider the size of a credit chip, and she'll clear a room faster than a hull breach alarm." The 6-legged cat creature, hush, Gia had decided, because it was the quietest of the group, actually moved to get a better view of the storytelling session. Still safely behind Umbra, but positioned where it could watch Gia's expressions and gestures. "We were doing a supply run to this agricultural station," Gia went on, "and apparently their ecosystem included these harmless little arachnids that helped with pest control. Harmless being the operative word. These things couldn't hurt a soap bubble, but Yuki takes one look at the cargo bay after loading and decides she's not setting foot in there until every single spider has been relocated." She paused to eat from her own food supply, making it clear that the nutrition bars she left scattered around were gifts, not bribes or traps. "So there's me and Gorthak, crawling around the cargo bay with makeshift nets, trying to catch spider-sized creatures, while Yuki directs operations from the safety of the corridor. "There's one behind the supply crate," she calls out. "Watch out for the one on the ceiling." Like we're hunting dangerous predators instead of creatures that probably think we're flying mountains. By the third day of this routine, something had shifted. The cubs still didn't trust her. They were too smart and too traumatized for that. But they'd stopped seeing her as an active threat. Umbra still maintained his protective stance, but his body language had relaxed from preparing to die fighting to watching for trouble. More importantly, they were listening. "You know what the real problem is with space travel?" Gia asked, settling into her usual spot with her usual casual demeanor. "It's not the mechanical failures or the navigation glitches or even the occasional asteroid collision. It's the laundry." This got her a soft trill from Shimmer, whose crystalline form had been gradually brightening during these sessions, as if curiosity was literally illuminating her from within. "I'm not joking," Gia said, responding to the trill as if it were a question. "You try doing laundry in zero gravity sometime. Ever seen what happens when the spin cycle activates? In a washing unit that's not properly secured." "I have. It's like a tornado made of soap suds and dirty uniforms." She reached for another nutrition bar, then paused as if considering something. "You know what?" she said quietly, her voice losing its theatrical storytelling tone for the first time. "You're home now. This is home." The words hung in the air like a promise, simple and direct, and completely unlike anything the cubs had heard from an adult in weeks. Not, "You're safe," which implied temporary security. Not, "We'll take care of you," which implied dependence and obligation. Just, "You're home." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Nix, the smallest, most fragile-looking of the cubs, took a tentative step forward. Just one step, but it was the first time any of them had moved toward an adult since they'd been found. Gia didn't react, didn't acknowledge the movement, didn't do anything that might spook the tiny shadow creature back into hiding. She just continued her casual commentary on the challenges of maintaining clean clothing in deep space. But when Nix took another step, and then another, eventually coming close enough to investigate one of the discarded nutrition bar wrappers, Gia felt something tight and painful unclench in her chest. "There you go," she murmured, so quietly that it might have been meant for herself. "There you go, little one." Nix looked up at her with those liquid starlight eyes, and for the first time since the rescue, didn't immediately flee or attack. Instead, the small creature settled down just within arm's reach, close enough to touch if Gia had been inclined to try. She wasn't. Not yet. But it was a beginning. Behind Nix, the other cubs watched with the intensity of creatures trying to understand a completely new kind of adult behavior. An adult who talked to the air, who left food without conditions, who said, "You're home," like it was the most natural thing in the universe. An adult who might, possibly, maybe, if they were very lucky and very careful, actually mean it. 3 weeks later, Cargo Bay 2 had transformed from a makeshift prison into something that looked suspiciously like a very chaotic nursery. Nix had claimed the space directly beside Gia's usual storytelling spot, curling into a shadow puddle that somehow managed to radiate contentment. Shimmer had taken to creating light patterns that seemed designed purely for entertainment, geometric shapes that danced across the walls, while Gia spun tales of their various misadventures. And Hush, the six-legged cat creature, had developed the habit of bringing Gia small objects it had found around the ship. A bolt here, a piece of colorful wire there, like offerings from a very strange and endearing magpie. "So, Kemp," Gia was saying, while Flick practiced some kind of aerial acrobatics that involved ricocheting off the walls in patterns that would have made a physicist weep, "Kemp decides that the best way to impress this traitor on station Osiris is to demonstrate our superior cargo handling capabilities, which sounds reasonable right up until you factor in Kemp's definition of superior. Growl had discovered that his sonic abilities could be modulated for music rather than warfare, and had been experimenting with harmonics that turned his threatening screeches into something approaching melody. Not good melody, mind you, but the effort was endearing. The demonstration, Gia continued, involved using the cargo loading arms to juggle 3 shipping containers simultaneously while the bay doors were open to space. Because nothing says professional freight operation like turning basic safety protocols into a circus act. Even Umbra had begun to relax, though he still maintained his self-appointed role as the group's protector. He'd positioned himself where he could watch both the cubs and any potential threats, but his constant state of hypervigilance had eased into something more like watchful alertness. Predictably, Gia said, reaching over to scratch behind what she'd determined were Nyx's equivalent of ears, one of the containers started drifting toward the station's docking ring. Slowly, mind you, but with the kind of inexorable momentum that suggested we were about to redecorate their main concourse with several tons of emergency medical supplies. The cubs had developed distinct personalities as their trauma began to heal. Nyx was curious and gentle, always the first to investigate new situations, but also the quickest to retreat to safety. Shimmer was an artist, creating increasingly complex light displays that seemed to reflect her emotional state. Flick was pure kinetic energy, constantly moving and exploring every corner of their expanding territory. Growl had appointed himself the group's musician and alarm system, while Hush collected interesting objects with the focused determination of a very small archaeologist. And Umbra was still their leader, their protector, the one who made the important decisions about when it was safe to trust and when it was time to be cautious. The really impressive part, Gia continued, was watching Yuki thread our ship through the gap between the drifting container and the station, while Kemp tried to explain to traffic control why we needed emergency clearance for accidental projectile containment. It had taken time to learn their individual needs. Shimmer required a diet heavy in crystalline minerals that the ship's fabricators could barely manage. Growl needed specific sonic frequencies for proper rest cycles. Nyx seemed to photosynthesize starlight during sleep, which explained why the little shadow creature always gravitated toward the observation ports. But they were thriving. More than thriving, they were becoming a family, which was why the proximity alarm that started wailing throughout the ship felt like such a personal insult. "Captain," Yuki's voice crackled over the comm with the kind of tension that meant trouble. "We've got company." Military cruiser, transponder identifies it as the UCS Vigilance. They're requesting permission to board. Gia felt every muscle in her body tense, and she wasn't the only one. All 6 cubs immediately shifted into defensive positions, with Umbra placing himself between the others and the cargo bay entrance. "Tell them we're a civilian freight vessel with no military cargo," Gia said, trying to keep her voice calm while her mind raced through possibilities. Standard inspection protocols. "Already tried that, Captain. They're not interested in our cargo manifest. They're asking about recovered xenobiological specimens and demanding immediate transfer of said specimens to military custody." Of course they were. "Military custody," Gia repeated, watching Nyx press closer to her side, while Shimmer's light pattern shifted from playful geometries to the aggressive strobing that meant danger. "Let me guess. For their own safety and proper care?" "That's the official line." "Unofficially, Captain." Yuki's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I'm reading weapons signatures. They're not planning to take no for an answer. Gia closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of 6 pairs of alien eyes watching her, with the kind of trust that came from weeks of patient relationship building. Trust that said, "You told us we were home, now prove it." "How long do we have?" They're requesting immediate compliance. Docking in 10 minutes, whether we cooperate or not. 10 minutes to figure out how to protect 6 traumatized alien children from a military force that saw them as specimens to be studied rather than individuals to be respected. 10 minutes to prove that her promise of home wasn't just another adult lie. "Gorthak," she called over the comm, "can you give me a few extra minutes? Maybe our docking systems develop some temporary mechanical difficulties?" "Already on it, Captain. But I can't delay them for long without it looking suspicious." "Right." Gia looked at the cubs, who were watching her with the kind of focused attention that suggested they understood exactly what was happening. "Yuki, are they alone out there?" "Far as I can tell. 1 cruiser, military configuration, probably crew of about 30. 30 trained military personnel against 1 freight captain and her crew of misfits. The smart play was to hand over the cubs and hope the authorities treated them well. The safe play was to comply with military orders and avoid charges of obstruction. The human play was to tell the authorities exactly where they could stick their compliance. "Rhea," Gia called, "I need you to document the cubs' current health status. Full medical profiles, psychological assessments, evidence of recovery and adaptation. Make it official." "Gia, what are you planning?" "I'm planning to prove that these kids don't need military custody because they already have a family." She looked at Umbra, who had moved to stand directly in front of her in a protective stance that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "They're not specimens. They're not salvage. They're crew members." "Captain," Yuki's voice carried a note of admiration mixed with concern, "that's either the most brilliant plan I've ever heard or the most insane. Why can't it be both?" The docking was as aggressive as expected. Magnetic clamps engaging with enough force to rattle the ship's superstructure, followed by the hiss of emergency airlocks connecting. Heavy footsteps echoed through the corridors, accompanied by the distinctive whine of military-grade scanning equipment. Commander Voss was exactly what Gia had expected. Regulation uniform, regulation haircut, and the kind of regulation personality that viewed everything in terms of orders, compliance, and proper procedures. He entered Cargo Bay 2 with a full security detail, apparently expecting to find 6 dangerous alien creatures in containment. Instead, he found a family having story time. The cubs had arranged themselves in their now familiar protective formation, but instead of the feral hostility they'd displayed weeks ago, they showed the kind of coordinated alertness that spoke of confidence rather than desperation. They knew Gia would protect them. They knew they were home. "Commander Voss," Gia said pleasantly, not rising from her position on the floor where Nix was curled against her side like a living shadow. "Welcome aboard the Stellar Nomad. I understand you're interested in meeting my crew. Captain, these are xenobiological specimens recovered from Research Station Theta 9. They require immediate transfer to proper military facilities for evaluation and containment." "Specimens?" Gia raised an eyebrow. "Commander, I think there's been some confusion. These are crew members. Nix here is training in navigation systems. Shimmer's been learning about optical communications. Umbra's shown remarkable aptitude for security protocols. It was a stretch, but not entirely untrue. The cubs had been exploring the ship, learning its systems, becoming part of its operation in the way that family members naturally did. Captain, these creatures are potentially dangerous. These children, Gia interrupted, her voice carrying the kind of steel that meant the conversation was about to get interesting, are under my protection. They're healthy, they're safe, and they're thriving. Which is more than I can say for what would happen if you dragged them off to some military research facility. Commander Voss gestured to his security team, but before they could move, something remarkable happened. The cubs didn't scatter or cower or prepare for desperate battle. Instead, they moved to surround Gia in a protective formation that mirrored what Umbra had been doing for them. They weren't just accepting her protection. They were offering theirs in return. "You see that, Commander?" Gia asked softly, as Shimmer's light patterns shifted to create a gentle barrier of luminescence, while Growl produced a low, harmonious tone that somehow conveyed both warning and welcome. "That's not the behavior of specimens. That's the behavior of family." The standoff lasted for exactly 38 seconds, which was long enough for Commander Voss to realize that extracting 6 young aliens from someone they clearly considered family would require force that couldn't be justified in any official report. "I'll be filing a full report with Xenobiology Command," he said finally, his tone suggesting this wasn't over. "You do that," Gia replied pleasantly. "Make sure you include their current health status, their integration into ship operations, and their obvious emotional well-being. I'm sure Command will find it very educational reading." After the military team departed, grudgingly and with many pointed warnings about proper procedures, the cubs gradually relaxed back into their normal activities. But something had changed. The cubs weren't just healing anymore. They were home, truly and completely, in the way that had nothing to do with location and everything to do with belonging. "So," Gia said, settling back into her storytelling position while her very unusual family arranged themselves around her. "Anyone want to hear about the time Gorthak accidentally programmed our food processors to only produce dessert for a week?" The enthusiastic chittering, trilling, and general sounds of approval that greeted this suggestion were all the answer she needed. Home, it turned out, wasn't about the place you came from. It was about the people who chose to keep you.